Life has a peculiar way of leading us into moments we never saw coming. I've got a story, one I've kept close because, well, it's not exactly simple. Have you ever felt like you were teetering on the edge between what's right and what's wrong, not by choice, but because life seemed determined to push you there? That was me that day, as if the cosmos had decided to play a strange joke, and I was the punchline. It began on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I wasn't doing anything noteworthy, just tackling a few lazy weekend tasks. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the dryer in the distance. While sorting through my wardrobe for clothes to donate, my hand brushed against an old mini dress I hadn't thought about in years. Now, don't misunderstand, I don't usually wear things like that anymore. I'd like to think I've moved past that phase. But holding it brought back a wave of nostalgia. It was a relic from a younger, bolder version of myself, a time when confidence came effortlessly and life was ruled by whimsy and freedom. On impulse, I slipped it on. I wasn't expecting much, but when I caught my reflection, I couldn't help but grin. It fit tighter than I remembered, clinging in ways that felt both awkward and oddly flattering. I was still chuckling at the sight when a knock at the door broke my reverie. Who on earth could that be? I muttered, glancing down at my less than presentable state. My hair was a mess, and I was certainly not prepared for company. I opened the door to find my nephew, Ethan, standing there. But Ethan wasn't the kid I used to babysit anymore. At 22, he was a man, broad shoulders, self-assured, and radiating the kind of easy charm that made people take notice. In one hand, he held a bag of tools, and in the other, that same familiar, effortless smile. "Ma'am, you called about the leaky faucet, remember?" Ethan's deep, smooth voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up, startled. "Oh, right," I said, realizing I had completely forgotten about asking him to fix the guest bathroom sink. Standing in front of me was Ethan, tall and effortlessly confident, the kind of presence that could make anyone stop and take notice. At 23, he'd outgrown the awkwardness of adolescence and stepped fully into a natural charisma. His broad shoulders stretched his t-shirt just enough to hint at strength beneath, and his easy smile carried a charm that felt almost too practiced. I suddenly felt aware of my outfit, a throwback dress I hadn't worn in years, and an odd mix of embarrassment and nostalgia washed over me. But I forced a smile and waved him in. "Yes, come in. The bathroom's at the end of the hall." As Ethan walked past me, I caught the faintest scent of his cologne, something woodsy and clean. He moved with a confidence that was neither rushed nor exaggerated, his gaze briefly flicking toward me before he turned his focus ahead. There was something magnetic about him, as if he knew the effect he had but chose not to wield it overtly. I returned to my wardrobe sorting, but a strange tension lingered. Not uncomfortable, just unexpected. You know how some moments feel charged in ways you can't quite explain? I felt it now, like an invisible thread had been strung taut between us, vibrating ever so slightly. Ethan's voice called out from the bathroom. "Ma'am, could you come here for a sec? I think I need a hand." Curiosity tugged at me, and I made my way to the bathroom. Ethan was crouched by the sink, his forearms exposed as he rolled up his sleeves, revealing a lean strength that made everything he did seem effortless. He was holding a wrench, his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, but when he glanced up at me, his usual grin returned, disarming as always. "I think the pipe's stuck," he said, gesturing toward the faucet. "Can you hold this while I try to loosen it?" "Sure," I said, stepping closer. The bathroom was small, and before I realized it, we were standing shoulder to shoulder. The warmth radiating from him was unmistakable, and I could feel the subtle brush of his arm against mine as he worked. I tried to focus on the task, but my gaze kept wandering, first to the way his hands moved deftly around the wrench, then to the sharp line of his jaw when he glanced sideways at me. At one point, our eyes met briefly, and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust my grip on the faucet. Was it my imagination, or did his gaze linger a second too long? "You okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He hesitated, his lips curving into a slow, deliberate smile. "Yeah. Just making sure I don't mess up your sink." I laughed softly, hoping it would cut through the tension. "No pressure, right? You're the expert here." After a few moments, he finally loosened the pipe and stood, brushing his hands against his jeans. "All done," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "Should work perfectly now." "Thanks," I said, trying to sound breezy. "You're a lifesaver." But Ethan didn't move. He crossed his arms, his gaze shifting to me with a mix of amusement and something else, something unreadable but heavy. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "I don't think I've ever seen you wear anything like that before." I froze, his words landing harder than I expected. "Oh, this old thing." I laughed nervously, tugging at the hem of the dress. "It's just something I found in the back of my closet. I was planning to donate it." Ethan tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. He didn't say anything at first, just smiled, soft, knowing. "It suits you," he said, his voice quieter, more deliberate. I opened my mouth to reply but couldn't find the words. Thanks," I managed, my cheeks burning. I turned quickly, heading for the door, but I felt his presence close behind me. "Ma'am," Ethan called, his voice low and steady, stopping me in the hallway. I turned to face him, suddenly hyper-aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the air grew heavier, the silence stretching into something unspoken. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated, then smiled, but this time, it felt different, almost as if he knew something I didn't. Ethan's hesitation left an imprint on me long after he walked out the door. The way he looked at me, the unspoken weight in his words, it lingered like an unfinished sentence, one that I couldn't ignore. That night, I curled up on the couch, the soft glow of the television flickering across the room. The static of background noise couldn't drown out my thoughts. I cycled through them endlessly, trying to rationalize, to downplay, to convince myself it was all just a misunderstanding. He's family, I reminded myself, again and again. Yet the memory of his gaze, so intent and searching, wouldn't let me rest. When my phone buzzed, the sound cut through the quiet like a sharp inhale. I picked it up, and there it was, his name on the screen. The knot in my stomach tightened. His message was simple, almost innocuous, but it felt charged with something deeper. "Can I ask you something?" A strange mix of curiosity and apprehension crept over me as I replied. Each word he sent after that seemed to unravel the fragile thread I was clinging to. His observations, his admissions, they weren't just casual remarks. They carried a gravity I wasn't prepared for, and each one pulled me further into a confusing web of feelings I didn't know how to untangle. By the time I set my phone down, my thoughts were a storm. His words lingered in my mind, creating ripples of questions I couldn't answer. Was this really just an innocent misunderstanding, or had something shifted between us, subtly and irreversibly? The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease with a hot cup of coffee and the comfort of routine. But when the knock at the door came, it shattered any illusion of normalcy. Ethan stood there, his posture casual but his eyes betraying a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. He moved into the house without hesitation, and I followed, my heart pounding with each step. In the living room, the air between us felt heavier than before. I could feel his presence as if it filled the entire space, demanding attention. He sat down, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and I could see the faint tension in the line of his jaw. I tried to focus on the details of the moment, the steam curling from my coffee mug, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. Anything to distract from the way his gaze pinned me in place. And yet, the emotions stirred within me refused to be ignored. A strange mix of unease, curiosity, and something else I couldn't name. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't comfort either. It was the awareness of something unspoken, an undercurrent neither of us wanted to acknowledge but both seemed acutely aware of. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too, that sense of walking a precarious line, unsure of where it might lead. When Ethan left, I felt a fleeting wave of relief, but it wasn't long before that sense of unease crept back. I stood there for a moment, the air in the house thick with something unsaid, something I couldn't quite shake off. I returned to the living room, trying to focus on a few tasks to distract myself from the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. But as I passed by the door, something caught my eye. A piece of paper had slipped through the crack beneath it. I bent down, picked it up, and immediately recognized the neat handwriting. It was Ethan's. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. It was slightly crumpled, as if he had written it in haste. Inside, the words were clear and precise. I know you asked me to leave, and I respect that. But I can't pretend these feelings don't exist. His words hit me like a punch. I felt my heart race, confusion swirling in my chest. Was this real? Was he serious? Why did it feel like something deeper was at play? I didn't know how to respond. I stood there, staring at the paper, unsure whether to be angry, flattered, or terrified. I placed the letter down, stepping back as if distancing myself from the reality it represented. But even then, the words wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment on his part. But deep down, I knew that things could never go back to normal. Just as I thought I had composed myself, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. No, I thought. But when I opened it, there stood Ethan, his eyes searching mine, his usual smile replaced by something much more serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and firm. I froze, unsure of how to react. My instincts screamed at me to shut the door and retreat from this, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. A part of me wanted to hear him out, to understand what was going on in his mind, even if it terrified me. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked, not waiting for an invitation. He stepped past me, his presence filling the doorway in a way that felt oddly invasive. I closed the door behind him and led him into the living room. He sat down on the couch, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The tension in the air was palpable. Neither of us spoke for a moment. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, as if he were waiting for something. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice faltering slightly as I sat down across from him. "I'm not pretending anymore," he said, his words direct. "Do you feel anything? Even a little?" His question hung in the air like an accusation. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to feel. This was Ethan, my nephew, my family. How could I possibly respond to something like that? "Ethan," I started, my voice trembling. "We're family. This isn't right." He lowered his gaze, nodding slowly. "I know," he murmured. "I know it's not right. But I can't keep this inside anymore. I had to tell you." The silence that followed was suffocating. I couldn't find the words to fix this, to make it go away. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I was trapped in a moment I never asked for, and yet here I was, unable to escape. Suddenly, he wrapped his arms around me and gave me a hug. I was stunned. The warmth from his arms made me want to let go of everything outside just to be with him like this. He kissed my hair lightly, the kiss gradually slid down to my forehead. That kiss made me breathe heavily, my heart pounding. The warmth in his breath made me ecstatic. I also had my own desires, but it seemed like there were barriers that were difficult to overcome that made me hesitate to step out of my comfort zone. The kiss slid down to my lips again. The warmth of his lips really pushed me to step out of my comfort zone. Once again, I really wanted to forget everything outside, just wanted to focus on him. Our lips entwined, our tongues found each other. The emotions from the long kiss made our body temperature increase. I felt the excitement in his heartbeat. I also felt my whole body heating up abnormally. The passions and desires came like a tsunami, engulfing everything. We sank deep into the waves of passion, unable to rise and escape. His hands began to wander up my dress. Desire and lust made his actions more violent. His violence did not make me uncomfortable, but on the contrary, it made me more desirous. The emotions I had suppressed for so long seemed to have a chance to rise. It overwhelmed all my rational thoughts for so long. His hands placed on my dress, lifting each layer of the dress. His hands on my chest with warmth and dexterity made me sink deep into the feelings of desire, trembling. Our lips only separated when we felt breathless. Then we were entangled with each other. But when the action seemed to want to go further, I quickly pushed him away. I was not ready to go on this dangerous adventure, although my heart screamed and urged me to move. Stop. We can't do this. He looked at me with a gasp. His eyes showed sadness and disappointment. He nodded, but I could see the regret and longing in his eyes. Okay, he said softly. But this isn't over. We'll talk about this again. Without another word, he walked to the door and left. When the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a strange relief, but it was quickly replaced with a deep sense of unease. Something had shifted between us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. As I turned back to the living room, I saw a piece of paper wedged beneath the door. My heart sank. I knew exactly who it was from before I even picked it up. Trembling, I opened the letter. I stood frozen, the letter in my hands. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding. Was this real? Was he serious? And why, despite every ounce of reason, did a part of me hesitate to push this away completely? That night, as I lay in bed, struggling to push the thoughts of Ethan from my mind, my phone buzzed. It was a message from him. My heart skipped a beat as I saw his name on the screen, the words inside making my stomach tighten. He wanted to know if I had received his text earlier. Hesitant, I typed back that I had but reminded him that we couldn't keep going down this road. His reply was almost instant. I'll stop if that's what you want. But tell me, do you feel anything for me? Even just a little. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my pulse racing. I wanted to deny it, to protect us both from the dangerous territory we were treading, but the truth was, my feelings for him were far from simple. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't deny the tremor in my chest whenever I saw him, whenever he was near. I typed out my response, each word heavy with the weight of everything unspoken between us. Ethan, you're my nephew. That's all I can say. It was the only answer I could give, even if it was the hardest thing I'd ever said. The conversation ended, but the feeling of his words lingered, haunting me long after I put my phone down. The next morning, I tried to push it all aside, focusing on work to distract myself from the confusing emotions swirling inside me. But as soon as I sat at my desk, I felt it, a presence at the window. I looked up, and there he was. Ethan. Standing outside my office, his hands jammed into his pockets, his gaze intense and unwavering. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't just let him in. I couldn't face him like this. But he wouldn't leave. His presence was impossible to ignore. My breath caught in my throat as I made my way to the door, stepping outside. What are you doing here, Ethan? I asked, trying to sound composed, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I had to see you, he said, his tone quieter, more earnest than I'd ever heard before. We need to talk. He was close now, so close I could feel the warmth of his body. It made my heart race, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. I tried to hold my ground, but his words felt like a weight on my chest. "I told you last night, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, "this isn't healthy. We can't keep doing this." But Ethan didn't back away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "I know it's wrong. I know it shouldn't be like this, but I can't stop feeling it. I can't stop thinking about you." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way his words made my chest tighten, made something stir deep inside me. Before I could respond, his hand brushed against mine. A simple touch. But it sent a jolt of electricity through my body, my breath hitching. My skin tingled where his fingers had grazed mine, and for a moment, I found it hard to breathe. "Ethan, stop," I whispered, stepping back, trying to put distance between us. But Ethan wouldn't let me pull away completely. He gently grasped my wrist, his fingers warm and steady against my skin. The touch was light but grounding. I felt the weight of it, the pressure in my chest growing tighter. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice low and full of something I couldn't ignore. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me dizzy. I wanted to pull away, to tell him that this wasn't right, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the closeness that made my pulse race. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of us, the space between us closing in. His other hand moved to my shoulder, gently pulling me closer. I felt my heart flutter, my body betraying my mind, and I didn't know how to stop it. "Ethan, I started, but my words were cut off as he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured, his voice low, full of longing. And for a split second, I almost let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to make it work. But I quickly pushed the thought aside. This wasn't right. I pulled away, my heart racing, my chest tightening with a mixture of longing and guilt. I couldn't look at him anymore. "I can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't how it's supposed to be." He didn't respond immediately, but I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of them on my back as I walked away, my body aching with the memory of his touch. I needed to create space, to figure out what was happening between us. But as I stepped back inside, I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not yet.